afternoon, and welcome to the third lecture of the 2025 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 24th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. And as always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for giving us some great additional publicity. Frankfort has many celebrities. Few have gained worldwide fame, if even their names aren't commonly known. And fewer have left legacies that are in the hearts and minds of millions. The phrase, "man is a dog's best friend," has probably led to the saving of millions of animals and the better treatment of animals worldwide. But like all famous people, their lives are more detailed and rich than their legacies would have you believe. And so we're very glad to have our guest speaker today shed a light on the life of the subject of his book. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of everyone here at the library, we just want to thank you for coming out and joining us on this afternoon. I know I'm glad to be in the air conditioning, so I'm sure that you probably are too. We're glad to have one of our dear friends back with us today to share on his biography of George Graham Vest. Stephen M. Vest is the editor and publisher of Kentucky Monthly, a Governor Award in the Arts Media honoree. Founded in 1998, Kentucky Monthly has more than 100,000 readers. In addition to his George Graham Vest biography, he is the author of Unexpected Inheritance, a memoir about being raised by older parents and a hard-to-please grandmother. Two collections of columns, including That Kind of Journalist, and the publisher of the 2012 anthology, Kentucky's 12 Days of Christmas, with editor James B. Good. Vest holds journalism and English degrees from the University of Louisville and Murray State University. His work has appeared in newspapers nationwide, including the Journal of Kentucky Studies, Still, and the Anthology of Woods and Waters by Ron Ellis. A frequent speaker, Vest teaches communications at Campbellsville University, public speaking at Midway University, and feature writing and storytelling at Eastern Kentucky University. He and his wife, Kay, live right here in Frankfort, and they have 4 grown children, Christopher, Katie, Molly, and Sydney. Please help me to welcome to the podium today, Steve Vest.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm probably going to wander around a little bit. Can y'all hear me okay? I wanted to thank you all for coming. It does me good today because yesterday I spoke at the Kentucky Genealogical and History Association meeting. I was one of the speakers, and my session drew 2 people. And they were so polite, both of them stayed until the end before they told me that they meant to be in a different section. So, just so y'all are clear, we're talking about George Graham Vest today, and y'all are in the right spot, right? So I'm going to try to focus a little bit today on just the Kentucky aspects of George, but I will get into the dog is man's best friend, which actually took place in Warrensburg, Missouri. It was a court case. It was a Missouri Supreme Court case where he ends up giving the closing argument, which I'll share. We were trying earlier, we were going to have Ronald Reagan do the speech. But if you get home and you want to, you can go on YouTube and look up Ronald Reagan, Tribute to a Dog. There is a speech from Death Valley Days, a TV show where Ronald Reagan gives a speech. And then there was a really bad made-for-TV movie called Old Drum where Scott Bakula from Quantum Leap, he portrays George Graham Vest. Neither one of them looked much like him. You know, both of them were taller guys, more athletic-looking guys, and as some of y'all might have overheard, George was described as being the same height standing up as he was sitting down. He was about 5 foot, maybe 5'4", and until his later years was a pretty broad fella. So if we get into the part about him being a Confederate, which he was briefly, that height situation is what led him to be a legislator. He was not a enthusiastic enrollee, and I will explain that. But how he ended up in the Confederate Congress, I think, is kind of comical. But it all started, though. George Graham Vest was born. He was born right over here, basically where the old YMCA building was. That was where his grandparents lived. His name was George Washington Graham, and George Washington Graham eventually was a Confederate representative with George Graham Vest, but he was named after him, and they lived in a house over in South Frankfort where the old YMCA was, and then his family built the house that's right next door to the library, the Vest Lindsay house, and he lived there until he lived there from when he was a young child. It became kind of a boarding house. It was, the property went all the way to the river. But at one time, and I think it was in the 1850 census, there's more than 20 people living in the house. It had an addition that was built onto it, and he lived there. But he attended what was called the B.B. Sayer Academy. And the B.B. Sayer Academy, from what best I can gather, is where Hoggies is today. And it was a guy, B.B. Sayer, who lived up behind the Capitol in the house with the Widow Watch up on the hill in Tanglewood. And people would travel and stay and lodge to study with B.B. Sayer. And B.B. Sayer was apparently quite an educator. And if I ever do another history book, it might be on B.B. Sayer. Because by the time George reaches the Senate in 1877, at that time there were really only 30-something states, so there were only 60-something senators, and 7 of the senators were former B.B. Sayer students. Both of the Kentucky senators, the 2 Missouri senators, and 3 other state senators from other places that had studied under Sayer. Well, George, he graduates from the Sayer School. He goes to Centre College, and he has gotten such good education from Sayer that they admit him at Centre as a junior. So he only goes to Centre for 2 years, and then he goes to Transylvania Law School, and he decides that he doesn't really want to be a lawyer, so he quits law school, and he and his brother-in-law, this is right around the time of his parents' passing, and I'll get back to his dad here in a second. It's part of another great Frankfort story, but around the time that his parents had passed away, he and his brother-in-law and his sister decide they're going to move to Owensboro, Kentucky, and they're going to start a newspaper. And so they move out there, they start a newspaper, and about 6 months in, George decides this is no way to make a living. There has to be an easier way to make a living than trying to put out a newspaper. And I wish I'd have paid attention to him, because I've been spending 28 years trying to make a living putting out a publication. And so he decides, okay, I'm not going to do this. He quits and he goes back to law school, gets back into law school, and he's the valedictorian of the class of 1853. In that same class is John Marshall Harlan, who becomes a Supreme Court justice eventually. But George is the person who's the valedictorian. So all these people, though, this is leading up to the Dog's Man's Best Friend, is that all these people that he knew at the Sayer School, a lot of them ended up going to Centre with him. A lot of them ended up at Transy Law School. And when he gets to Missouri and he becomes an attorney, a lot of the attorneys in Missouri are also former Centre, Transy people, or Sayer people. And he runs in this kind of circle that everywhere he goes, he's surrounded by people that he knows. So one of the best examples of that, I mentioned that he goes to the United States Senate. That's later on. But back in Frankfort, 1845, his dad is on the committee at the Frankfort Cemetery that has decided they want to have as many celebrities as they can in the cemetery. So, Patty, you can argue this one if you want to. You can argue it, but there are a lot of Revolutionary War graves up in the cemetery. And from what I understand, there's not a lot of Revolutionary War bodies in the cemetery. these people, they would go out and they would find these Revolutionary War soldiers, and they would go to the farm and they'd say, hey, we'd like Grandpa to be buried in the Frankfort cemetery, because they were trying to build it up and make it a real destination cemetery that had all these famous people in it. And sometimes the people would say, yeah, that sounds great. And they'd dig up Grandpa and they'd move him to Frankfort. Other people would say, you know, no, I think Grandpa should stay here on the farm. And they'd say, well, okay. And then they'd put a marker up in the cemetery for that person and never bring the body there. So there are, Yeah. So there are a lot of markers for a lot of people who are not underneath those markers. Now, one of the other people, though, that is, or part of him is Daniel Boone. And John Javes, George's dad, was on the committee that was assigned to go and get Daniel Boone and bring him back to Frankfort. So they created a caravan, and they go out to Missouri. They go to, Booneville, Missouri. They go to the cemetery, which is on a private farm, and they say, hey, we're from Frankfort, Kentucky. We'd like to have Daniel and Rebecca Boone for our cemetery back in Kentucky. And they said, no, you can't. And they said, well, we'd like to have him. And they said, no. So they waited until after dark, and they came back, and they dug up Rebecca and Daniel and brought them on back anyway. Well, most people will agree that they did get Rebecca. She had a more substantial casket, and they're pretty sure Rebecca Boone's buried up here. Now, maybe not all of Daniel. Maybe part of Daniel. Maybe somebody else. Now, at the time, Missouri really liked to make fun of us, because at that time, that part of the cemetery was a restricted cemetery. It was a segregated cemetery. And so the Missourians like to make fun of us that, you got this, segregated cemetery, but you dug up a guy out here and moved him to your cemetery, that it violates your own rules. So they think that they might have gotten Daniel Boone's manservant and maybe part of Daniel Boone. They're not really sure. And so now I think everybody kind of agrees that Daniel Boone is probably buried in the Frankfort Cemetery, but probably buried in Missouri as well. Now, Rebecca's up here. And so, a couple years ago, we did a marking where we put markers on the graves of both Daniel Boone and Rebecca Boone from the DAR and the SAR and everything. Well, George was he was at that event, the original event, when they interred Daniel Boone there. And, so it's kind of funny that eventually he ends up out in Missouri in the same area where Daniel Boone had been. But these people that I was talking about that kind of followed him, they knew him all the way from when he was a kid, and he was a student at the Sayers School and a member of the Sunday School Sabbath School at First Presbyterian Church. Now, when he gets to the Senate in 1877, the minister who had given the program at the burial of Daniel Boone up in the cemetery is the chaplain of the United States Senate, the former pastor at the First Presbyterian Church of Frankfort, who eventually ended up in Alexandria, Virginia, becomes the chaplain to the United States Senate. So it's just another case of George running back into somebody he's known for most of his life. But when he gets to Missouri, he's headed west. He's going to seek his fame and fortune. He's on a boat that runs out of water. The river gets shallow, and he gets out. He's in a buggy accident, stagecoach accident. Ends up breaking an arm and injuring a leg, and he ends up going to a little town called Georgetown, Missouri. And in Georgetown, Missouri, he realizes that almost all the inhabitants of Georgetown, Missouri are originally people from Georgetown, Kentucky, who he knows some of them. And he decides, okay, well, I'll just stay here. This will be a good place for a while. I'll be an attorney here. And one of the darker chapters in the book is about a trial he's involved in Georgetown, Missouri. I'll let y'all read that one. But it's pretty bad. But he stays there. He gets a lot of death threats following the case. And every time that he gets threatened, according to his moral code, it means I can't leave here. If I leave, I'll look like a coward, so I'm staying. So eventually he stays in Missouri and becomes an attorney and moves on he starts his law practice in Georgetown, and then the county seat is moved to a town called Sedalia. He goes there, it's a larger community, and then he becomes a state representative, and which is what leads him to become a Confederate. And then after the war, though, there's a trial in 1869. One man has threatened that if any dogs come on his property, he's lost some sheep to dogs, and he says, if any dogs come on my property, the next one of them I'm going to shoot. And that night or the night after that, or sometime very quickly after that, he sees the shadowy figure of this dog on the horizon, and he tells his hired hand, go shoot that dog. And he does, and then they quickly realize they've shot this dog named Drum, who is a noted hunting dog owned by his brother-in-law and neighbor. So they decide, okay, we can't let him know we shot his dog. So they try to cover it up. They put the dog on a mule, and they take him, and they try to get rid of him. But all these people see what's going on, and they eventually tell the neighbor, hey, your neighbor killed your dog, and he took him over to this big creek over here, and that's where you'll find the dog. And so they do, and there's an investigation. And so the neighbor decides he's going to sue his brother-in-law for damages for killing his dog. So he does, and he wins. But then the other neighbor countersues and appeals, and he wins, and it makes it all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. Well, the two guys who are prosecuting the case are both former Transy law guys, and they don't feel like they're going to win. And the case is some pretty big names. I mean, T.T. Crittenden is one of the attorneys who became the governor of Missouri, and he's the guy who pardoned Frank James later on. And they just feel like they just don't have it. So one of them says, well, George is outside, and George can talk about anything. And George had this reputation. He had memorized most of the Bible, most of the classics, and could just quote anything off the top of his head. So one of them said, hey, we need a closing argument in this dog case. And he's like, oh, yeah, the dog case. He hadn't been a part of this dog case up until this point. And he's like, the dog case. They said, yeah, we need a closing argument. We need somebody to say some stuff about dogs. We want somebody that can, play on people's passions, and we know that you're the person to do it. And so he said, well, yeah, dogs. I can do dogs. And so supposedly he walks in, no notes, no preparation, nothing, just walks in, and he delivers what is called Tribute to a Dog. Now, that's what I was going to tell you. You can go look up Ronald Reagan doing it and Scott Bakula doing it. I don't know that either one of them do it all that well. It's a little cheesier than I would think it went. But it is kind of funny if you watch the Ronald Reagan version. It's on Death Valley days, and they zoom in on the faces of all the people in the courtroom, and each one of them is crying, and the judge, he's crying. The other attorney, the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, they're all crying. Everybody's crying. It's pretty good, so it's pretty dramatic. But he never really says, dog is man's best friend. And if you listen real closely, he had this ability to pull things from all of these things that he had read and known. And my daughter claims that if you really pay attention to what he says, that Lord Tennyson probably deserves credit for coining the phrase dog's man's best friend. And I've told her my last name's not Tennyson, so I don't care. And, she can go with whatever she believes. But she also told me she couldn't believe that I had spent time writing a book about a Confederate in the first place. So we'll get to that in a minute. But so this is his speech, and it's called, this is what became known as Tribute to a Dog. The best friend a man has in this world may turn against him and become his enemy. His son or his daughter that he has reared with loving care may prove ungrateful. The money he has he may lose. It flies away from him perhaps when he needs it most. A man's reputation may be sacrificed in a moment of ill-considered action. The people who are prone to fall on their knees and do us honor when success is with us may be the first to throw the stone of malice when failure settles his cloud upon our heads. The one absolutely unselfish friend that a man has in this selfish world, the one that never deserts him, the one that never proves ungrateful or treacherous is his dog. A man's dog stands by him in prosperity and in poverty, in health and in sickness. It will sleep on the cold ground where the wintry winds blow and the snow drives fiercely if only it can be by its master's side. He will kiss the hand that has no food to offer. He will lick the sores and the wounds that come with the encounters with roughness of the world. He guards the sleep of his pauper master as if he were a prince. When all other friends desert him, he remains. When riches take wings and reputations fall to pieces, he is as constant in his love as the sun is in his journey through the heavens. If misfortune drives the master forth, an outcast in the world, friendless and homeless, the faithful dog asks no higher privilege than that of accompanying him to guard him against the danger and to fight against his enemies. And when the last scene comes and death takes the master in his embrace and his body is laid away in the cold ground, no matter if all other friends pursue their way, there by the graveside the noble dog will be found, his head between his paws, his eyes sad but open, and alert watchfulness, faithful and true, even in death. George Graham Vest, 1870. And they won the case. Got $500 for the dog. That's what the jury awarded. The value of a dog at the time was $50, so the judge reduced the amount, but they still won. The case was ended. And $50 in 1870 was a pretty substantial number. $500 would have been silly money back in the day. So, you know, that kind of made George at least a regional celebrity at the time. And quickly after that, there was a case that came to him where there was a man in Lexington, Missouri, whose daughter got a divorce, and the daughter moves back home with dad. And pretty soon after that, there's a lot of stuff happening around the farm at night. People are wandering through the farm and tearing stuff up and damaging things, and they suspect that it's the ex-husband. And then somebody distributes brochures to all the neighbors about what a terrible woman she is. And they're so mad that they pack up and they move. They sell their farm and they move to another community, and the same thing happens again. So finally the dad has had enough, and he goes back to Lexington, Missouri, finds the ex-husband coming out of a store, and in broad daylight in front of 100 people shoots and kills the guy. And so, you know, he's arrested. He's charged with cold-blooded murder on the streets of this town, and he hires George to be his attorney. And George goes into court and basically convinces the jury that yes, my client did kill the guy, but he deserved killing. He was in need of killing, and the jury sided with him, and the guy was acquitted of the murder. Well, Frank and Jesse James and Cole Younger, they get wind of this, and they decide, hey, this is the guy we need to represent us. And so they meet with George over breakfast, and they decide that George is going to be their attorney, and he agrees to it under the stipulation that he gets 10% of whatever they take, and that they follow two rules. Number one, they can only rob institutions. They can only go after the banks and the trains, the railroads, because those are kind of seen as the establishment. And Frank and Jesse and Cole Younger, they're kind of seen as Robin Hood or something. And as long as they don't leave the state of Missouri, he says, if you don't leave the state of Missouri and you only go after those types of things, I can get a jury to acquit you on anything. And so they hire him. He becomes their attorney. Well, if you're familiar with the history of Frank and Jesse James, that night they go and they rob a train. They get $9,000, and they take the money and they decide, okay, what we're going to do is, I've heard that this guy, Governor Ames, who was a temporary governor of Mississippi, has stolen all kinds of money from the state of Mississippi, and he's got it in a bank somewhere up in Minnesota. And if we could go and steal that money back, which he shouldn't have taken in the first place, we could go legit. We don't have to be criminals anymore. That's what we're going to do. So they're not only, are they violating George's rule about leaving the state of Missouri, they go out and they hire a guy from Minnesota to be their tour guide. And they head off up to Missouri. They book really nice rooms in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They buy all kinds of nice new clothes. They buy new horses. They buy the best tack they can find for these horses. And they all buy matching linen jumper coats. And then they're going to go out and they're going to rob this bank. They're not sure if they're going to Mankato or where they're going, but after investigating it, they find that Ames's money, they think, is in this bank in Northfield, Missouri. Now, they head off to Northfield, Missouri, and they hadn't done any research, apparently, into this place, because they said that Northfield was inhabited by a bunch of just gentleman farmers, and they'd be an easy pushover, and they'd take all their money, and that would be great. And, they'd get all this money, and they'd ride back to Missouri, and everything would be wonderful. Well, what they didn't know was, first off, it was the first day of hunting season. So all the men have their guns with them in their wagons somewhere close by. Number two, 90-something% of the inhabitants of the town of Northfield, Missouri, were originally from a town called St. Albans, Vermont. Now, you've probably not heard of St. Albans, Vermont, but St. Albans, Vermont does tie back to Kentucky. There was a Colonel Bennett, who was part of John Hunt Morgan's raiders, who was captured during the Civil War and escaped with a bunch of guys into Canada. And they decide what they're going to do is they're going to raid across the United States border into the United States in northern states. And but what they're going to do is they're going to kind of come into town from different places, not look like they're together, and then at some appointed time they're going to attack the bank or the store or whatever it is they're going to rob, and then they'll sneak back across the border, and nobody will ever know what they did. Well, all these guys in Northfield, Minnesota had lived in St. Albans when this happened. They were former Union veterans who had moved west, and here comes Frank and Jesse and them. They decide, here's our plan. We're going to scatter out, and we're going to come to Northfield from different places, and we're not going to look like we're together, and then at an appointed time we're going to go and we're going to rob the bank. Now, they didn't take into account that they're all wearing matching clothes, so they kind of look suspicious. And the first couple guys come across the bridge, and another guy's coming down the street, and these guys are like, this looks just like the St. Albans raid. And so they're onto him right away. And by the time Jesse and two other guys go into the bank, everybody in town is alert to Frank and Jesse are in town, or these Confederates are in town, or whatever. And this is 10 years, 12 years after the end of this, 11 years after the end of the Civil War. But they look like soldiers, and so they look like they're a unit. And one of my favorite stories in the book is there's a kid who is home from medical school, and he's one of the first ones to kind of catch on to this. And so he gets his dad's old Civil War rifle and goes up into the third floor of this hotel, and he's waiting for him, and as they come out, the whole town unleashes on him. And the first person killed is the guy from Minnesota that hired to be their tour guide. So he's dead. He's gone. And then they just unleash on these other guys. And eventually it leads to the end of Frank and Jesse James's gang. Frank and Jesse do make it back to Missouri. Jesse never stands trial for anything, so George never represents him in anything. Eventually, Frank does surrender himself to the governor, T.T. Crittenden again, and has to stand trial for a couple of crimes. And George's law partner, Phillips, represents him and does get him acquitted of the trial of the crimes that he had committed. But by this time, George has gone to the United States Senate, so he didn't have anything to do with that after that point. But I just find that to be a funny story. The best part of it, though, is the medical school student who shot the guy on the street. He laid claim to the guy. They buried him. He went and dug him back up. I guess it kind of runs in the story that we have grave robbers, right? But he dug him back up, took him back to medical school, and that was his cadaver he used in medical school. And then he had him bleached, or whatever you do to make the skeleton look presentable in some way. And when I was doing research for the book, I found a thing where they had gone. He was in his 80s, I think. He did become a doctor, and he was practicing medicine in the Dakotas, and they went to interview him about the Frank and Jesse raid and all this stuff on some commemoration day. And he's sitting in his office talking to him, and over his shoulder is this guy's skeleton in the corner, who he took with him everywhere he went for the rest of his life. So, but I think it's the thing that I found most Kentucky about George, and Frankfort too, is that he's kind of connected. It's a whole lot less than 6 degrees of connection to all these people who just show up again and again and again in at least the first 7 chapters of the book. That's kind of the recurring theme. The last couple of chapters of the book are more about his time in the Senate and his time in the his time in the U.S. Senate, and then his later days where he retires, where he wrote, I think it's 17 long features for the Saturday Evening Post, where he goes back and he examines his entire life. And basically, if you read the book, it is a biography. It is, but in some ways it's an autobiography, because there's 17 portions of it that are, George is telling the story in his own words. All I did was piece them together, make sure they were in the right chronological order, make sure that the people that he identifies are correct, which they are. But, and I just tried to stay out of his way, because he's a great storyteller, and I let him tell the story in those places as much as anything. And he's pretty funny at times. He was a contemporary of Mark Twain. They were both in Missouri around the same time. George is actually 5 years older, I think, than Twain. But one of the things that you get into the later part, you're talking about the dogs and the helpful of animals. In Mark Twain's later years, he was a big advocate for trying to abolish experimentation on animals. And he wrote a couple of essays that you won't find them in the collected works of Mark Twain anywhere. They are extremely dark. Part of it's in this book too. But it's the only time that I know of that Mark Twain, who is quoted by so many people, in this section, Mark Twain actually quotes somebody, George Vest. He, right in the beginning, right in the middle of the beginning of the story, where he's making this impassioned plea about we shouldn't be doing experiments on animals, he turns to, hey, dog is man's best friend, and tribute to a dog, which he quotes from. And it's one of the only times that I know of that Mark Twain quoted somebody else in his work. I think we've all quoted Twain in ours, But, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. But I understand there's a microphone, and Diane is going to wander around, and people can ask questions, and I will talk as long as you stay and ask questions. Yesterday, that didn't mean very much. That went real quickly. Oh, you got the microphone up here? And John, you'd ask a question last time about the cemetery as well. And we can get to that if you want to. It's kind of an interesting thing. I should probably, before I do this, I will tell you real quickly the story about the Confederacy. Because he was one of these people. He was not he was not really a secessionist. Now, you have to understand a little bit of American history they don't teach is that, what we're taught is that Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland were neutral. They were border states, they were neutral. Maryland might have been neutral. They didn't really send many troops into the war on either side, and they stayed out of it. There's, several battles that take place there. I mean, Antietam is one of the biggest ones. But Maryland did pretty much stay out of the war as much as probably was possible at the time. Both North and South wandered through Maryland at different times. Kentucky was not that way. Kentucky was divided, but 2/3 of Kentucky was for the North, only 1/3 for the South. And the South had its own capital in Bowling Green. Now in Missouri, it never had a chance to do either of those things. The largest military installation in the United States outside of the East Coast was in St. Louis, Missouri. And when the South started seceding, before Missouri ever even had a chance to secede or do anything like that, the government seized the capital. So it was basically it was a state under military rule, and the legislature, since most of the people in the legislature were some different variety of probably Democrats, and most of the people in the Union Army were Republicans. They all fled, and they're put under the protection of what was called the Home Guard, which is basically like the National Guard. The Kentucky National Guard would be that, but this is what they did. And so they're out wandering around, and they do end up in one battle called the Battle of the Hemp Bales, and George is in the battle. And at the end of the battle, he says, "This is not for me. I don't want to be in the war. I don't want to be a soldier. I don't like this. This is just not for me. I will never do this again. This is silly." Well, at the same time, they've decided, if we're going to be forced to be, in the Confederacy, we need to send a representative to the legislature. So this one member of the group, who was described as being 6'3", and this is back in 1860s, 6'3", muscular and very handsome. He decides, I'm going to be our representative in Montgomery, Alabama. And George stands up and says, why would we send this guy? If we were in a fight, this guy might do you some good. I mean, look at him. I mean, he's a masterpiece. If you want this guy fighting on your side, I'm not going to do you any good at all. Send me. I'll go do it. And so they do. They vote. They elect George. They send him to the legislature. He serves in the legislature with his grandfather and other people he knew from Kentucky. He ends up in the Senate. He does become kind of a part of Jefferson Davis's cabinet, because Jefferson Davis, the Crittendens, the Breckinridges, all the members of the cabinet, they're all transy guys. He's a transy guy. But after the war, he ends up going kind of into exile and then back home. So my daughter says, why would you even write a book about a guy who was a Confederate? Well, he was not an enthusiastic Confederate, for one. His views on things were not radical. He didn't hold on to the lost cause for the rest of his life and bemoan, Gone with the Wind kind of stuff. And he lived a pretty long life, and he helped create Yellowstone Park, which I think is his biggest accomplishment that people don't really understand. It was a big part of who he was. And I've told my daughter, I'm like, really, if you live to be 74 years old in that time period, I mean, that's a pretty long life, and you've done all these things, including Yellowstone. Do you really want the fact that, you want the whole life to be focused on 4 years of your life? I don't want people thinking of the 4 to 6 years I spent in college as the only thing I did in my entire life. So, yes, he did have that brief part of it, and I think I'm really fair in the book about his participation and his relationships with people, including the story about the Frankfort Cemetery, which we may get to here in a second. But, I don't think you can just discount everything else he did. And I tried to be extremely fair because of this. Everybody assumes this is my father or grandfather, and I did not want to go out and, everybody go, oh yeah, you wrote this, this puff piece book about your relative. I didn't even know he was my relative until halfway through this book. All I knew is we shared the same last name, and he happened to have a historic house around the corner from where I used to work at the newspaper. I didn't grow up knowing anything about George. I'm glad that I do now, but I wanted to show the good and the bad and present a fair representation of him, and I think that's what I do in the book. But I needed to get that part out just so people understand. So,
tell us about his family life. Did he have a wife? Did he have children?
He did. He married his college sweetheart. Her name was Sally Sneed. She was from Danville, Kentucky. He proposed to her 4 different times. The first 3 times, the family objected. They didn't think George would amount to anything. And Sally kind of agreed. She said that George is a person, she goes, I've seen George, and George is a person who lives up to or down to the people he's around. So if I can make sure that George is around good, aspiring people, he'll be a good aspiring person. If but he would really rather just go hunting and fishing and do not much anything. And if he hangs out with those people, that's what he'll do. And so she was kind of a strong taskmaster and made sure that they did move to Sedalia, which had a larger and stronger bar association. So he couldn't be a country attorney and spend most of his time out hunting and fishing and not really doing anything. And, she's the one that kind of edged him into politics. They had 3 children. One of his daughter eventually married the guy that invented the Colt rifle, and she was a Colt. And then his one son died while he was in office. He was his personal secretary and died in Washington, D.C. And his other son lived in Missouri and had a son that was actually a future Missouri state governor. So, that can't be it. Come on, Gene. Okay.
His grandparents are buried off of 421. What is it? The Louis Town? Yeah. Where Fisher's Mill Road comes in.
Okay.
They're over there in that little field. There's a little fence about.
And that's his grandparents?
That's the Coles, I think. They ran Legion's Crossing.
Okay.
Over towards Midway. And there's some of the buildings still left that were there.
Okay. Because his parents are buried up here in the Frankfort Cemetery. They're in Section A. But his grandparents, yeah.
Minersville, I think, not Franklin Town, but Judge James Potter was living over there, went to Georgetown College,
Okay.
became a preacher, and then he wound up moving to Missouri.
Yep. Well, yeah, I mean, it's back to the Confederate part is that George's parents are buried in the cemetery, but there's also a lady that's buried up there. Her name is Maria Fenwick. And Maria Fenwick, when John J. Vest died, this was in the 1850s. So we're talking 6-7 years before the Civil War even happened. He left money in his will for Maria for the rest of her life, that the family should take care of her and provide for her needs, and then actually gives her a stipend of money that she's to be paid every year for the rest of her life. And when she does die in the late 1860s, early 1870s, she's buried up in the Frankfort Cemetery in the Glens Creek section. And she has a nicer tombstone than either Mr. or Mrs. Vest have. And it says on the tombstone, Maria Fenwick, my nurse and my friend, George Graham Vest. So in 1870s, 1880s, a white man would not call a black person their friend unless they believed it to be true. And he did. And he paid for her tombstone, and that's where she's buried. And a lot of the people that had been previously, prior to the Civil War, had been enslaved, which were a couple people, by the Vest family. They went to Missouri with George. They stayed with George. There's a thing in the book, his porter for many, 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 many years is the only person in the room other than the family when he dies in 1904. And his porter had gone back and forth to Missouri, to Washington, D.C. with him for 24 years. George, for the most part, did not live in a hotel or an apartment when he was in D.C. He actually slept on the couch of the caretaker's house, along with him and his friend and his porter. So he had a kind of an, I think he was kind of an everyday guy. He said that when his family would come to town, he would take out rooms at the Willard Hotel because they liked to stay in nicer accommodations than he cared to stay in. His thing was he really liked to camp, and he liked to fish, and he liked to hunt. And that's what led to the Yellowstone stuff, is that General Sheridan and Colonel Sheridan, who were both Union officers, had been to Yellowstone, had been, worked on Yellowstone, talked about Yellowstone, and George had visited Yellowstone. And it was a concept, it was a thing. It wasn't defined. So George draws up all the legislation defining what is Yellowstone, the borders, the staffing, all of that kind of stuff. And he and Sheridan take the president, Chester Arthur, am I right? Okay. They take the president to Yellowstone on a 3-week hunting and fishing trip. And they send dispatches back, telegrams back about all the things they see while they're in Yellowstone. And all the newspapers publish this. And that's what made Yellowstone kind of famous. And there's photos from the trip in the book, along with the president, the Sheridans, and George. They're all together. His son's in the photo too. It's pretty neat picture. And they create Yellowstone. Now, have you ever seen the TV show Yellowstone? There's a in the sequel or prequel, sequel, I guess it's prequel. 1923 is a show where one of the nephew of the Dutton family goes to World War I, and when he comes back, he's in a hotel and he overhears this plan to subdivide Yellowstone and turn it into an amusement park or a recreational area, like maybe like Gatlinburg or something like that. And the son undoes all this plan and saves Yellowstone. Well, that actually did happen, but it happened in 1883, and George is the person that was in the corner of the room and overheard it. He was a member of the United States Senate and went back and had all the deals undone and saved Yellowstone Park. He doesn't show up a whole lot in the credit of it because for 22 of his 24 years, he was deeply in the minority in the Senate. But every piece of legislation eventually came through him. He was seen as the foremost authority on Yellowstone. They called him the self-appointed guardian of Yellowstone. And so bills, anything that had to do with Yellowstone, George had some piece in. So that's what he claimed to be his greatest fame. Back to the Saturday Evening Post thing that I talked about, he does not mention in his 17 pieces of autobiographical information that I had, he never mentions the dog speech once, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it led to at least one scholar out in Missouri or Kansas claims that they don't think the dog speech ever occurred at all, that it was a fiction. I don't believe that to be true, but it was kind of funny, but it's kind of interesting. One of his big heroes is Thomas Jefferson. And if you go to Thomas Jefferson's grave at Monticello, it lists the fact that he was one of the writers of the Constitution. It mentions he was one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was the founder of the University of Virginia. No mention of him being president of the United States. So, maybe somebody who was from a time period where a typical speech, and George gave a lot of these speeches, were 2.5 to 3 hours long. He may not have considered a 3-minute speech to be all that significant. But, kind of like with the Gettysburg Address, we all know the Gettysburg Address, but Abraham Lincoln was not the featured speaker at the dedication of Gettysburg. I can't remember the guy's name, but the other guy spoke for 2.5 hours, and none of us can tell you who he was. So, sometimes briefer is better. So, yeah. Yeah.
So he liked to hunt. Did he have hunting dogs?
He did.
Did he have a dog?
He did. He had hunting dogs. And that was the thing with Drum, the dog. I did go to the Old Drum Festival this year out in Warrensburg, Missouri. They have a whole festival about the trial, and they do reenactments, and they do the whole bit, and they have a big dog contest, and people bring their dogs in. And but yeah, this is not Old Drum; it's a depiction. But he was a hunting dog, and they said probably a blue tick hound, and but yeah, George had dogs when he was in Missouri. I don't think he had a dog when he was in D.C. Which most of the last 24 years of his life, he was in D.C. more than he was anywhere else.
So does he get recognized anywhere in Yellowstone?
They do. He's in the history of Yellowstone, and there's mentions of him. People that I know that have been there, I haven't been there, have said that he does get some credit. He probably doesn't get as much credit as he should. But it is funny if when you go to Warrensburg, Missouri, and you travel around the state of Missouri, I know of at least 5 statues of Drum, the dog. There's one in front of the old courthouse, one in front of the new courthouse. There's one in the state capitol, and there's at least, I think there's one in St. Louis, and there's an animal shelter in Ohio that has a depiction of Old Drum, but I don't think there's a statue of George anywhere. Anywhere. And if you go to the Vest Lindsay house across the street, there's not a picture of him in the house. There's a picture of some unknown Virginia legislator in there, but nothing of George, nothing of the Lindsays, who are the other half of the history of the house. So it's one of my goals. I'd like to have a picture of George to hang in his house.
We want the statue that Tom Brady got this week, right?
Yeah. Now, the Frankfort did have a banner of George when they did the famous people of Frankfort. He had a banner that Gene, I think, made, right? You and Russ made? Okay. But it used to be over kind of near Poor Richards, I think. Yeah, it was on Broadway, but it was kind of, I think it was a very similar photo to this one of George.
How did you select this dog to get that picture?
I didn't do it. The artist who created the book cover, the publishing company, they did it. And a lot of people wanted to know if that's his dog or how do we get a picture of Drum. Well, yeah, it does. I mean, it's pretty close, but I'm sorry, but that's an internet dog. And that's fake. That's a fake thing. That dog and that man were never together at any point. But so, how we doing?
We're doing good. Before I turn the mic over to John to tell you about what's going to be happening next month, I just want to mention that Steve has copies of the book.
I do.
At the back.
And I also have copies
copies of the broadside of the speech.
And free magazines.
Yeah, he brought us some free copies of Kentucky Monthly, which was very kind, so pick up one of those. But if you'd like to purchase a book and have that signed, Steve will take care of you.
I'll stay around if you had any questions you were afraid to ask. So.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to John. Thank you so much to Steve.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I just want to let everybody know that our next lecture, September 13, is at 1 o'clock, is Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky Constitution, New Scholarship Demonstrating Jefferson's Influence on the Founding of Kentucky and Its Modern-Day Relevance, by attorney Dennis Fleming, Jr., who's a first-time author and quite experienced. He was General Counsel to Economic Development. He was General Counsel to the Governor under Paul Patton and Chief Deputy Attorney General under Greg Stumbo. So check out his book, and we'll see you next month in that presentation. Thank you all.